The law of war also establishes rules for the types of weapons that countries may lawfully use during armed conflicts and bans the use of certain types of weapons. And there are a number of treaties and other international agreements that attempt to impose restrictions on the use of certain weapon systems or to regulate the use of weapons. But the general prohibition out there is on weapons that cause unnecessary suffering to combatants. This is a principle that dates back to the mid-19th century, as General McDaniel indicated in our earlier discussion. In this video blog, General McDaniel and I discuss allegations that Russia has used prohibited weapons in Ukraine, thereby violating the international law of war. Why don't we start with allegations out there that Russia has deployed and used cluster bombs in prosecuting its war in Ukraine. According to one European organization, Russia's use of cluster bombs in Ukraine is well documented, noting 134 individual incidents of their use as of mid-April. So what are cluster bombs and why would Russia use them, and why are they of questionable legality?
Professor Finnegan raises such a great point. I'm glad we're taking time today to discuss this. So a cluster bomb, very simply, is a short-range tactical weapon where you've got call it a bomb or a missile that's being shot out of a howitzer. It's a specialized launcher that the Russians use on an armored tracked platform like a tank that's been modified. And it'll shoot this missile up into the air, and it rises to about, almost a mile up. And then at that point, it opens up and it disperses like 50 round little canisters, which weigh, say, 3 or 4 pounds apiece. And these are like large grenades. They detonate upon landing and then they fragment. So it is especially effective as an anti-personnel weapon. It can be very effective if you're trying to reduce a convoy, a land convoy, or an airstrip. But as you can see with cluster bombs and that definition, there are a number of issues. First and foremost is they're not all going to detonate when they land. There's a high percentage, especially among the Russian cluster bombs, of having duds. And a dud, remember, just means it didn't detonate the first time. So these are often, spherical 3 or 4 pound object picked up by children or other civilians questioning what it is, and it can then go off. More generally, obviously, they are dispersed because the first missile that disperses them is like a mile up, and then they disperse as they land. And if so, that's over a wide area. So the chance, if you do in that way, of hitting a specific target is less likely. So when you look at these principles, as Professor Finnegan said, certainly unnecessary suffering, and then really military necessity. You can argue that all the principles almost are violated with cluster bombs, but it is the high potential for them exploding indiscriminately and thereby hitting civilian populations, which makes them so dangerous. There is, in fact, a convention on cluster bombs that was signed in 2008, fairly recently, and it produces and it prohibits not just the use, but the production, storage, or transfer of cluster bombs. Not all nations have signed it. There is a lot of debate about this still, because there can be a military use of this, which is appropriate under very limited circumstances, however. And of course, you have to avoid unnecessary suffering, and that's very difficult to do so with this type of weapon, which is truly a shotgun shell of massive proportions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Although that 2008 treaty has entered into force and more than 100 states around the world have joined the treaty, Russia notably has not signed on to that treaty, and neither has Ukraine for that matter. Another weapons system that has gotten some attention in the media is these so-called thermobaric weapons. Ukraine's ambassador to the United States has alleged that Russia has used what she referred to as vacuum bombs in Ukraine. And unlike cluster munitions, there's no treaty that explicitly prohibits the deployment or use of those weapons. Although, one view is that these weapons are not necessarily illegal if used in a manner that is otherwise consistent with the law of war. So, General McDaniel, what are thermobaric weapons, and why might they be problematic from the standpoint of international law?
So thermobaric weapons are rather horrific, frankly. It is a missile, again, a short-range tactical missile, range probably no more than 70 miles, the type of missile platform that the Russians are using. So it's sort of a stand back weapon, but it's also still just a tactical level weapon that has utility, as you said. It has utility against defensive fortifications, whether it's caves, tunnels, bunkers, and frankly has been used by the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. The difference is the Russians have used it extensively in Syria, in Aleppo, in an urban environment, still populated with civilians, and we're seeing that in Ukraine as well. So the weapon that's on this missile it's a container that it's a two-part container. It's filled with fuel oil, which will ignite, and then there's tiny bits of metal, highly ignitable metal that's contained in this fuel mixture in tiny pieces. So what happens is that explodes, and then there's a secondary explosion, which very small, necessary to ignite this fuel oil mixture. So what happens is the fuel oil mixture comes out, and it's a cloud, a mist, it's aerosolized. And then you just have a flash which will set it on fire. And you time this so it happens right as we're sort of at ground level. It's very successful in fortifications like that for three reasons. First, you have massive heat when this is ignited all at once. Secondly, it has a blast feature. The pressure itself is greater than that of a similar size conventional weapon. And thirdly, because it is, causing this high ignition and flare immediately, it takes all the oxygen out. So it is called a vacuum bomb because there's this mistaken belief that it'll suck all the oxygen out. That hasn't necessarily been proved, but it is a very successful weapon for the reasons that I've stated. The problem, of course, and I'll throw it back to you to further up on this, Professor Finnegan. The problem is in a civilian environment, which we have in Ukraine. We have, most of the fighting thus far has been in an urban area where you have troops that are hunkered down with civilians. So it's being used against the civilians, and it is absolutely a horrific weapon for the reasons I stated: blast, heat, and loss of oxygen. It's absolutely a horrific weapon to be using against civilians. So why don't you explain how that would violate then the laws of war, international humanitarian law?
There we go. I apologize. I had muted myself there. So I think as part of the debate that's going on around the world about the legality of thermobaric weapons, I think one view is that if those weapons can confer a military advantage in certain situations, and if those weapons are deployed in a way that is otherwise consistent with the law of war, so that the weapons are targeted only at military objectives, so that they're used in a way that minimizes the impact on civilians and civilian assets. In other words, they're used in a way that is mindful of the principle of distinction that is at the heart of international humanitarian law, then thermobaric weapons are not necessarily unlawful. I guess the suggestion here is, in analyzing whether the use of these weapons is unlawful will depend on the context and the circumstances. They are not unlawful per se, but may be unlawful under certain circumstances. So why don't we wrap up our discussion of unlawful or prohibited weapons at this point?